Are you ready to hear a true historical story that began in Turkey and could capture everyone's interest? I will share with you all the details of a mysterious map that some might call a parchment fragment, but which will change everything we thought we knew. Who was Piri Reis? In the dusty archives of an old palace, something extraordinary was waiting to be discovered. The year was 1929, and he would make a lasting mark on history by uncovering a mystery that would reverberate around the world for decades and raise questions that are still whispered about centuries later, even today. But to understand this mystery, let's first go back in time and take a look at those beautiful oceans filled with secrets and the past, created by a man's unsolvable and chilling strokes of the pen. Between 1465 and 1470, the waters of the Aegean Sea rippled beneath the feet of a young boy. The exact year is unknown, which is one of the many mysteries surrounding the man who would become known as Piri Reis. His full name was Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, and he was born in Gallipoli, a strategic peninsula where Europe and Asia almost touch each other at the narrow passage of the Dardanelles. This town was a gateway between worlds, a threshold. Perhaps it was fitting that someone born there would spend his life charting the boundaries between the known and the unknown. The air carried the scent of sea, salt, and adventure, mingling with the tar smell from the shipyards where vessels prepared for long voyages. Gallipoli was no ordinary coastal town. It was one of the Ottoman Empire's most important naval bases, a place where children grew up watching large ships come and go, where the rhythm of the waves and the creaking of wooden hulls became as familiar as the beating of their hearts. Young Piri must have listened to the sailors' tales in the market about distant shores and fierce battles, storms that could swallow ships, and winds that could bring either fortune or disaster. Every morning, the sunlight rose over the waters of the Dardanelles Strait, painting the strait in shades of gold and silver. Fishermen repaired their nets along the harbor, working skillfully and tirelessly with their calloused hands. Merchants sold their goods in many languages, including Greek, Turkish, Italian, and Arabic, reminding everyone that Gallipoli was a crossroads of civilizations. The smell of grilled fish and fresh bread from the market stalls filled the air. In this vibrant maritime world, the young Piri absorbed the culture of the sea. He watched ships being built and repaired, quickly learning the names of different types of vessels: elegant galleys with oar rows, triangular lateen-sailed cargo ships, agile coastal boats darting between islands. He must have heard the technical language of sailors, describing winds, currents, equipment, and navigation. However, beneath these childhood scenes, a special relationship was forming that would shape everything in the future. Piri's uncle was a man named Kemal Reis, a name that commanded great respect and influence in the Ottoman maritime world. Kemal Reis had already become a legendary figure among the pirates sailing the Mediterranean, operating under the Ottoman flag, raiding enemy ships and protecting Ottoman interests on the high seas. When Piri was just 11 years old, around 1881, his uncle took him aboard his ship as a young sailor and began an apprenticeship that would last about 15 years. The uncle-nephew relationship was more than just a family bond. It was a transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next. As the ships sailed across the Mediterranean Sea, visiting the coasts of Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia, young Piri was learning more than just maritime skills. He was learning to read the coastline, to understand how ports welcomed or rejected ships, to memorize the shapes of islands and the locations of dangerous rocks hidden beneath deceptive calm. Each voyage added new knowledge to the treasure trove of maritime information in his mind. Picture yourself on the deck of a ship coming into a strange harbor. The sun is hot, the glare off the water makes it hard to see, and the splash of the oars keeps time. In front of you, the coastline is slowly coming into view. First, it's just a blue-gray blur on the edge of your vision, but soon it becomes real features. A rocky point over there, some sand down below, white castle walls shining in the light. An old sea dog takes note of everything, how the color of water changes from deep blue to green as it gets shallower, how birds fly differently when near land, what new smells like pine trees or wild herbs come with an open sea breeze. This was Piri's education, repeated voyage after voyage, coast after coast, until at last the whole Mediterranean began to take form in his mind as something like a detailed map. The Mediterranean during those years was not a peaceful place. Ottoman, Venetian, Spanish, and Genoese played their moves on this board. Pirates often wore similar uniforms to Navy men. Privateers like Piri Reis worked in between officially sanctioned military service and independent raiding. It was in these late 1480s and early 1490s that Kemal and Piri moved about freely within the Western Mediterranean, bringing them into contact with diverse cultures, different map-making traditions, countless opportunities to gather nautical intelligence. Living as a corsair brought risks, but also great rewards. Every ship taken could offer precious cargo, spices from Far East lands, fine cloth, valuable metals, armaments. For Piri, though, another kind of treasure excited him just as much: maps and charts. Each vessel captured could potentially carry navigational documents showing paths traveled, coastlines seen through different maritime traditions' eyes, African coasts detailed on Portuguese charts, harbor configurations revealed through Italian portolan charts, newly discovered lands across the Atlantic hinted at by Spanish maps. Piri gathered this data, contrasting various representations of identical coastlines, observing differences and conformations, slowly sharpening a critical eye for cartographic precision. But even in the midst of the continual bustle of sea raids and naval battles, something much deeper was taking root in Piri's mind. In 1486, events in Spain sent shockwaves through the Muslim world that would continue to ripple for generations. The last Muslim city in Andalusia, Granada, fell to Christian forces, and with it ended almost 800 years of Islam on the Iberian Peninsula. Muslims who remained behind were treated cruelly. Pleas for help soon reached the Ottoman court. The Ottoman Empire, despite not having a dedicated ocean-going fleet at that time, sent Piri Reis with ships to rescue those who could escape. Piri rode with his uncle on these missions of mercy, looking on as the vessels bore refugees from Spanish shores to North Africa. The sight of the uprooted, the tale of a civilization's end, its cultural treasures and knowledge fleeing with it, had its effect. It was not simply a rescue operation, it was an act of witnessing the great turning points in history, those moments when the world's geography was being changed not only in terms of maps, but also in terms of culture and faith. The moon was low over the Spanish coast that night, as silver paths rippled across dark seas and ships moved out with their human cargo. The operations took place under cover of darkness and secrecy, eluding Christian patrol vessels. The refugees brought whatever they could: sacred texts carefully wrapped in oiled cloths, family heirlooms, children carrying dolls or some cherished object, and their faces expressed fear, grief, and gratitude all at once. Among them came scholars who had studied in the great libraries of Granada and Córdoba. These were men who preserved the works of ancient Greek philosophers when they were lost to Europe, who furthered mathematics and astronomy, who produced their own geographical works based on classical texts mixed with Islamic scholarship. With them came not only physical books and manuscripts, but centuries' worth of accumulated learning. The Iberian Peninsula had been a crucible where Christian, Muslim, and Jewish scholars had preserved and advanced classical learning, including geographical works of ancient Greece and Rome. Ptolemy's geography, lost to Western Europe for centuries, had been preserved and studied in Islamic Spain. Works on trigonometry, essential for navigation, had been refined there. The concept of the astrolabe, crucial for celestial navigation, had been perfected. Some of that knowledge was now being dispersed across the Mediterranean world, carried by refugees to new homes in North Africa, Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire. For young Piri, these voyages were profound. He saw the human cost of political and religious conflict. He also saw the portability of knowledge, how wisdom could be preserved even when kingdoms fell, how learning could be transmitted across cultures and generations. The scholars he met during these rescue missions may have influenced his later dedication to creating comprehensive navigational works that would preserve and transmit maritime knowledge. The Spanish coast at night had its own character. The darkness was not absolute. Stars shone overhead with an intensity rarely seen today. The Milky Way, a river of light across the heavens. Sailors navigated by these stars, knowing the positions of key constellations, using them to stay on course over open waters. The air was cooler at night, carrying the scent of the Spanish land. Dust and wild thyme and olive groves mingled with the eternal salt of the sea. The biggest turning point in Piri's maritime career was yet to come, waiting in the shifting currents of Ottoman politics. In 1494, Sultan Bajazet II issued a call that would transform the nature of Ottoman naval power. The Sultan was preparing for war with Venice, and he wanted the skilled pirates of the Mediterranean to join the official Ottoman navy. Kemal Reis and his nephew Piri answered that call, appearing before the Sultan in Istanbul to officially enter the service of the state. Kemal was given the rank of admiral. The title Reis itself meant captain or admiral, while Piri became captain of a ship under his uncle's command. The transition from privateer to naval officer brought new responsibilities and new possibilities. The Ottoman-Venetian wars in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were brutal events, with huge fleets clashing in waters that both sides considered essential to their survival. In 1999, during the Battle of Zonchio, also known as the First Battle of Lepanto, Piri sailed as part of a fleet of approximately 270 ships that broke through the Venetian lines to enter the Gulf of Corinth. The scale of these naval battles was staggering. Hundreds of galleys, powered by oarsmen and carrying soldiers and artillery, would maneuver in complex patterns, seeking to ram, board, or bombard enemy vessels. Each galley might have 150 to 200 oarsmen, typically slaves or prisoners, chained to their benches and rowing in coordinated rhythm directed by drum beats. Above them, soldiers and sailors prepared weapons: crossbows, arquebuses, swords, boarding pikes, and increasingly cannon. The sea would erupt in chaos during battle. The crack of cannon fire echoed across the water, so loud it could be heard for miles. Wood splintered and flew in lethal shards when cannonballs struck hulls. Men shouted in multiple languages: Turkish, Italian, Greek, Spanish, mixing with screams of the wounded and dying. Beneath it all, the steady beat of drums keeping time for the rowers, and the splash of oars driving ships forward. Piri was learning naval warfare at the highest level, understanding how fleets moved and fought, how intelligence and positioning could mean the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat. He learned to read the intentions of enemy commanders by observing fleet formations. He understood how weather conditions, wind direction, wave height, visibility affected tactical options. He saw how supply lines, reinforcements, and information determined the outcome of campaigns as much as individual battles. The Ottoman Navy consolidated its control over the eastern Mediterranean through a series of victories. In 1500, Kemal Reis led Ottoman forces to victory at the Battle of Modin, the Second Battle of Lepanto. The following year, battles to retake Modin and capture Navarino in modern-day Greece further extended Ottoman power. With each victory, Piri's reputation grew, his skills as both a naval commander and a navigator becoming more widely recognized. He was earning a name for himself separate from his uncle's shadow, becoming known as a capable captain in his own right. The Ottoman court began to recognize that modern naval warfare required not just brave fighters, but skilled navigators and strategists who understood geography, logistics, and the technical aspects of maritime operations. But it was during the raids in the Western Mediterranean, away from the grand set-piece battles, that something extraordinary would occur. In 1501, Kemal Reis and Piri returned to the western Mediterranean, conducting raids along the Spanish coast and nearby islands. During a naval engagement near Valencia, they captured several Spanish ships. This was routine enough. Captured vessels often yielded valuable cargo, information, and sometimes skilled sailors who could be interrogated about enemy positions and plans. But among the Spaniard crews, one prisoner would prove to be worth more than gold. The captured Spaniard claimed he had sailed with Christopher Columbus on his great voyages to the New World. This alone would have made him interesting, but what he possessed made him invaluable. He had a map, an early chart of the Americas that had been drawn by Columbus himself or under his direct supervision. In that era, maps were state secrets of the highest order, closely guarded pieces of strategic intelligence. The Spanish and Portuguese crowns treated geographical information as classified material, understanding that knowledge of new routes and lands translated directly into economic and military advantage. Unauthorized possession or distribution of such maps could result in severe punishment, even execution. To possess an original Columbus map was to hold a window into the greatest geographical discovery of the age. Columbus had made his first voyage across the Atlantic in 1492, just 9 years earlier. He had made subsequent voyages in 1493, 1498, and 1500 to 1504. Each voyage had added to European knowledge of the Caribbean, Central America, and the northern coast of South America. But Columbus himself had died in 1506, just 5 years before this encounter, and his original maps and charts were scattered or already lost. The captured Spaniard, whose name has not survived in the historical record, claimed to have participated in 3 of Columbus's voyages. He may have been a relatively minor crew member, perhaps a sailor or pilot who had made copies of Columbus's charts for his own use or received them as part of his compensation. Whatever the circumstances, he had the map, and now the Ottomans had it. Kemal Reis understood the treasure he had acquired. The map was carefully preserved, rolled, and stored away from moisture and damage. According to later accounts, when Kemal wrote his will before his death, he bequeathed this precious Columbus map to his nephew, Piri. It was a gift that acknowledged not just familial affection, but recognition of Piri's growing expertise in cartography and his genuine passion for understanding the world's geography. The Columbus map would become one of approximately 20 source maps that Piri would eventually use to create his own great work. But first, tragedy would strike, reshaping the course of Piri's life once more. Around 1511, Kemal Reis died in a shipwreck somewhere near the Aegean Islands. Some accounts place it near Naxos. The details vary. Some sources suggest it was a violent storm that overwhelmed his ship. Others hint at possible sabotage by rivals jealous of his success and influence. The Mediterranean was full of such rivalries, both political and personal, and a man as successful as Kemal Reis inevitably made enemies. Whatever the circumstances, the death of Kemal Reis left Piri without his mentor, his uncle, and his commanding officer. The man who had taught him everything about the sea, who had introduced him to the world of naval warfare and navigation, was gone. For nearly 30 years, from childhood into middle age, Kemal had been Piri's guide and protector. Grief and the loss of his patron led Piri to make a decision that would paradoxically produce his greatest achievements. He temporarily retired from active naval service and returned to Gallipoli, the town of his birth. There, in that familiar harbor town between the continents, Piri began to transform his decades of accumulated knowledge and experience into something lasting. The nights in Gallipoli were quiet compared to the chaos of naval battles. The town maintained its maritime character. Still ships came and went, sailors still told their tales in taverns, the smell of salt and tar still permeated the air. But for Piri, returned home after 30 years of constant voyaging and combat, there was a different quality to the place, a sense of reflection, of taking stock, of preserving what had been learned before it faded from memory. In a workshop or study, perhaps overlooking the Dardanelles where he could watch ships passing between seas, Piri began the painstaking work of creating a world map. He gathered his source materials carefully. The Columbus map inherited from his uncle, showing the newly discovered lands across the Atlantic.
8 Ptolemaic maps representing ancient geographical knowledge from the 2nd century, the accumulated wisdom of the classical world. 4 Portuguese maps showing recent discoveries along the Indian Ocean routes and newly explored African coasts, representing the cutting edge of Portuguese expansion. And an Arabic map of India, reflecting centuries of Islamic geographical scholarship. And additional charts whose specific origins would remain mysterious. The work demanded intense concentration and skill. Each source map used different scales, different projections, different conventions for representing coastlines and features. The Ptolemaic maps were drawn according to ancient Greek concepts of geography, with certain systematic distortions. The Portolan charts from Portugal and the Mediterranean used compass roses and rhumb lines. The Columbus map showed coastlines discovered just years earlier, with inevitable uncertainties and gaps. Piri had to compare them all, reconcile their differences, judge which details seemed most reliable based on his own seafaring experience, and then unify all this disparate information into a single coherent chart. It was detective work, scholarship, and artistry combined. The parchment he worked on was gazelle skin, carefully prepared and stretched to provide a smooth, durable surface for fine inkwork. Gazelle skin was preferred for important maps because of its fine grain and ability to hold detailed inkwork without bleeding or fading. The preparation of such parchment was an art in itself. The hide had to be soaked, scraped, stretched, dried, and treated to create the pale, smooth surface suitable for fine cartographic work. With compass and straight edge, pen and ink, Piri drew compass roses from which lines radiated outward, creating the characteristic wind rose network of a Portolan chart, a type of navigational map designed for practical use at sea, showing compass directions and sailing routes rather than the latitude and longitude grids that would become standard in later centuries. The work progressed slowly, carefully through 1511, 1512, and into 1513. In the dim light of oil lamps, Piri would have bent over his work, adding coastlines stroke by stroke, checking and rechecking against his source materials, adding the numerous annotations that would explain his sources and methods. As the work progressed, a remarkable image took shape on the gazelle skin. Europe, Africa, and the Atlantic were rendered with impressive accuracy. The newly discovered coasts of South America appeared in surprising detail, given how recently they had been explored by European ships. The Caribbean islands were recognizable, though arranged in ways that reflected the early confused understanding of their relationship to each other and to the mainland. And in the northwest section of the map, a peculiar composite coastline combined features of Cuba and Central America in ways that reflected Columbus's own misconceptions about what he had found. Columbus had believed until his death that he had reached Asia, that the islands of the Caribbean were offshore islands of the Indies, that Cuba was part of the Asian mainland. These misunderstandings were incorporated into his maps, and Piri faithfully reproduced them, showing the geographical knowledge as it existed in the early 1500s, errors and all. The African coastline was particularly impressive. Piri had access to Portuguese charts that reflected decades of careful exploration down the African coast. The Portuguese had been systematically mapping Africa since the early 1400s, each voyage pushing a little further south, establishing trading posts, taking careful notes of coastal features. By 1513, the entire African coast had been traversed and mapped, and Piri's synthesis of these Portuguese sources resulted in a representation of Africa that some modern analysts have calculated was accurate to within 50 miles in many sections. But perhaps even Piri himself didn't fully realize what curiosities and controversies his map would inspire centuries later. In the spring of 1513, specifically in the month of Muharram in the Islamic year 919, Piri Reis completed his world map and signed it. The completion must have brought a sense of satisfaction, of having created something worthy of his uncle's memory and his own decades of experience. He added extensive notes around the margins and across the map itself, 30 inscriptions in total, 29 in Ottoman Turkish and 1 in Arabic. These notes were far more than mere decoration. They were explanations of his sources, descriptions of the peoples and creatures found in different lands, and careful attributions of where his information came from. One inscription was particularly significant. The coasts and islands on this map are taken from Columbus's map.
Piri presented his completed map to Sultan Selim I in 1517, after the Ottoman conquest of Egypt. The timing was significant. Selim, known to history as Selim the Grim for his harsh rule and military prowess, was expanding the Ottoman Empire at a rapid pace. He had recently conquered the Mamluk Sultanate, bringing Egypt, Syria, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina under Ottoman control. A world map showing the latest discoveries by Spanish and Portuguese explorers would have been of considerable strategic interest to such a sultan, revealing the extent of European expansion and the new routes being opened to wealth and power. The Portuguese had already rounded Africa and were establishing themselves in the Indian Ocean, threatening traditional trade routes that had enriched the Mamluks and now benefited the Ottomans. Understanding the full scope of European maritime activity was crucial for Ottoman policy. What Sultan Selim thought of the map, or how he used it, remains unknown. No contemporary accounts describe his reaction. The map vanished from the historical record after its presentation, disappearing into the depths of the Topkapı Palace collections, where it would rest forgotten for more than 400 years. Piri himself would continue his career, returning to active naval service and creating other cartographic works, but the fate of his 1513 world map remained a mystery until its rediscovery in the 20th century. Yet, Piri's love of cartography and the sea was far from exhausted. Between 1511 and 1521, Piri compiled another monumental work, though of a different character than his world map. This was the Kitab-ı Bahriye, the Book of Navigation, sometimes called the Book of Maritime Matters or the Book of the Sea. While the world map was a single artifact showing global geography, the Kitab-ı Bahriye was an extensive maritime atlas and guidebook focused specifically on the Mediterranean Sea. The work was deeply personal, drawn from Piri's own decades of sailing Mediterranean waters with his uncle and in Ottoman service. Each chapter focused on a specific location, a harbor, an island, a stretch of coastline, accompanied by a detailed portolan chart. But the maps were only part of the value. Piri added crucial practical information for navigators: where to find fresh water on islands that appeared barren, which harbors offered safe anchorage in different wind conditions, crucial knowledge when sudden storms could destroy ships caught in exposed anchorages, what rocks and shoals posed dangers and how to recognize them from sea, what landmarks were visible from different approach angles, a distinctive mountain peak, a prominent tower, the shape of a headland, what fortifications or settlements might be encountered at each location, which might be friendly and which hostile. The first version, completed in 1521, contained 130 chapters and maps. It was written in a practical style, intended for actual use by sailors. The work began with an introduction that offered general information about navigation, how to read compass directions, how to use the stars for navigation, the characteristics of different winds and storms, and the nature of the major oceans. Then came the detailed chapters, starting at the Dardanelles, that narrow strait Piri knew so well from his childhood, and proceeding counterclockwise around the entire Mediterranean basin. The Aegean Islands received extensive coverage, each significant island meriting its own chapter with detailed charts showing harbors, anchorages, and coastal features. The Ionian Sea, that stretched between Greece and Italy. The Adriatic, with its complex coastline and numerous islands. The Italian coast, from Venice down through the heel and toe of the Italian boot. The Balearic Islands off Spain, Majorca, Minorca, Ibiza. The Strait of Gibraltar, that narrow passage from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. The North African coast, from modern Morocco through Tunisia and Libya to Egypt. The Nile Delta, with its multiple branches and complex approaches. The Levantine coast, modern Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey, and back to Anatolia and the starting point. All were meticulously documented, harbor by harbor, cape by cape, island by island. Imagine the usefulness of such a work to an Ottoman captain assigned to patrol unfamiliar waters. Instead of relying on local pilots or risky trial-and-error approaches to strange harbors, the captain could consult Piri's book and find detailed information. Approaching from the southwest, keep the White Tower on the headland to your left. When it aligns with the church dome visible behind it, turn toward the harbor mouth.
Beware of the submerged rocks 50 paces from the western jetty. The bottom is good holding ground for anchors. Fresh water can be obtained from the spring at the base of the hill behind the town. Such information could mean the difference between a successful voyage and disaster. Piri presented this first version to Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who had ascended to the Ottoman throne in 1520. Suleiman would become known as perhaps the greatest of all Ottoman sultans, presiding over a golden age of Ottoman power, culture, and achievement. It was a time when artisans and scholars sought to gain the new sultan's favor by presenting exemplary works, and Piri's Book of Navigation was certainly that. The work was recognized as valuable, combining practical utility with impressive scholarship and artistry. But Piri would have occasion to revise and expand it. Between 1524 and 1526, at the encouragement of Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, Piri created a second, expanded version of the Kitab-ı Bahriye. Ibrahim Pasha was Suleiman's close friend and most powerful minister, and his patronage of arts and learning was substantial. His interest in Piri's work likely reflected both personal fascination and recognition of the strategic value of comprehensive maritime information. This revised edition contained 210 chapters with corresponding maps, and was more elaborately decorated with Ottoman miniature paintings. The miniatures showed ships in full sail, sea monsters sporting in the waves, detailed depictions of coastal fortresses and cities. It was less a practical tool for working sailors and more a luxury item befitting a sultan's library, though it maintained all the detailed navigational information of the first version. The revised version ran to 434 pages and contained 290 maps. It was an extraordinary achievement, representing the accumulated Mediterranean geographical knowledge of not just Piri himself, but drawing on the Portolan chart tradition that had developed over centuries of European maritime activity, combined with Ottoman and Arabic geographical learning. The illuminated manuscripts were works of art in themselves. The calligraphy was elegant, the miniature paintings showed meticulous attention to detail, and the overall presentation was worthy of a royal treasury. The Book of Navigation would prove more durable in its influence than the world map. Numerous manuscript copies were made after Piri's death, preserved in libraries across the Ottoman Empire, and eventually in European collections. While the original manuscripts in Piri's own hand have been lost, at least 43 copies from later centuries survive. Some are practical copies, showing signs of use at sea with worn pages and salt stains. Others are luxurious presentation copies created by Istanbul's finest miniaturists, clearly intended for wealthy patrons who valued the work as much for its artistic merit as navigational utility.
The Kitab-ı Bahriye became a standard reference work for Ottoman mariners for centuries. It was still being copied and consulted in the 1800s, centuries after Piri's death, a testament to the enduring value of his observations and the comprehensive nature of his documentation. But even as Piri worked on his cartographic legacy, the tides of his naval career were rising again. In 1528, Piri created a second world map. Like the first, this one drew upon multiple source materials and represented the latest geographical knowledge. Unfortunately, like the first, it did not survive intact. Only a fragment remains, showing Greenland and North America from Labrador and Newfoundland down to Florida, Cuba, Hispaniola, Jamaica, and parts of Central America. The fragment measures approximately 70 centimeters square, and like the 1513 map, is drawn on parchment with inscriptions in Ottoman Turkish. This Second World map seems to have been based on different and more recent sources than the first, reflecting the rapid pace at which European explorers were filling in details of the New World. Between 1513 and 1528, numerous expeditions had refined understanding of the Americas. Magellan's expedition had circumnavigated the globe from 1519 to 1522, proving definitively that the Americas were indeed a separate landmass from Asia and revealing the vast extent of the Pacific Ocean. The Spanish conquest of Mexico had begun, adding new geographical information about the interior of Central America. The style and approach of the second map are consistent with the first, suggesting Piri's methods and standards had remained constant, but
The information had been updated to reflect these new discoveries. By this time, Piri was no longer a young sailor. He was approaching or perhaps past 60 years of age, an advanced age for that era, especially for someone who had spent decades in the harsh conditions of naval warfare. Yet his career was far from over. His reputation as both a naval commander and a cartographer made him valuable to the Ottoman state, and the empire was expanding its interests beyond the Mediterranean into the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. The Ottoman conquest of Egypt in 1517 had given the empire control of the Red Sea coasts and opened possibilities for challenging Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese had been systematically building a maritime empire in the east since Vasco da Gama had reached India in 1498. They controlled key ports and choke points, extracting tribute and dominating the spice trade that had once flowed through Ottoman-controlled lands. For the Ottomans, breaking Portuguese power in the east was both an economic and strategic imperative. The years between 1528 and the late 1540s are somewhat mysterious. There's a notable gap in the historical record regarding Piri's activities. Some scholars wonder if he might have been engaged in further travels, gathering more material for his cartographic projects, or perhaps in semi-retirement, living quietly in Gallipoli or Istanbul. But what is certain is that he re-emerged in the mid-16th century with a new, exalted rank and a challenging mission. In 1547, at approximately 77 years of age, Piri Reis was appointed as the Ottoman fleet commander in the Indian Ocean, with the additional title of Admiral of the Fleet in Egypt. His headquarters were in Suez, and his task was formidable: to challenge Portuguese dominance in the waters around Arabia and the approaches to India. The Portuguese had established a maritime empire controlling crucial trade routes, and the Ottomans wanted to break that monopoly. For an elderly man by 16th century standards, this was an enormous responsibility. The Indian Ocean was far from Ottoman home waters. Supply lines stretched across the desert from Cairo to Suez. The enemy was experienced, well-equipped and entrenched in fortified positions. The climate was punishing. The heat of the Red Sea and Arabian coast, the sudden violent storms of the monsoon season, and the unfamiliar diseases that struck European and Mediterranean sailors with particular severity.
But Piri brought decades of experience and his unmatched knowledge of maritime affairs to the task. On February 26, 1548, Piri achieved a significant victory by recapturing the city of Aden in Yemen, which had fallen under Portuguese control. Aden was strategically crucial, controlling access to the Red Sea from the Indian Ocean. Its capture demonstrated that even in his late 70s, Piri retained his naval skills and strategic acumen. The siege of Aden required careful coordination of naval and land forces. Ottoman ships bombarded the Portuguese fortifications while soldiers prepared for assault. The Portuguese garrison was isolated, unable to receive reinforcements, and eventually capitulated. The victory restored Ottoman control over the southern approaches to the Red Sea and sent a message that Ottoman power was extending into new maritime domains. He followed this victory by taking the important base of Muscat in 1552, and shortly after conquering the island of Kish. These were not easy campaigns. The Portuguese fought tenaciously to defend their empire. Naval battles in the Indian Ocean could be as fierce as any in the Mediterranean, with the added challenges of unfamiliar waters, long distances from home bases, and the need to coordinate with local allies who had their own agendas. The campaign was going well, validating the Ottoman decision to appoint Piri to this crucial command despite his advanced age. His experience, his understanding of naval warfare, his knowledge of coastlines and navigation, all served him well. He was proving that age had not diminished his capabilities. But ahead lay a decision that would unravel everything. In 1552, Piri assembled a fleet of 31 ships and more than 800 soldiers to besiege Hormuz Island. Hormuz was a strategic jewel, perhaps the most important single location in the entire Portuguese maritime empire in the east. It controlled access to the Red Sea and the lucrative trade that flowed through it. Capturing it would be a major blow to Portuguese power in the region and would open the Persian Gulf to Ottoman naval activity. The siege began with Ottoman forces bombarding the fortress and preparing for what promised to be a lengthy campaign. Hormuz was heavily fortified, garrisoned by experienced Portuguese soldiers, and had withstood previous attacks. The fortress sat on a barren, rocky island with limited fresh water, making siege warfare particularly challenging. Attackers had to maintain their own supply lines across hostile waters while preventing the defenders from receiving relief. But then, something unexpected occurred. The inhabitants of Hormuz offered Piri great treasures to lift the siege, a substantial bribe to spare them from conquest. The offer was tempting, the treasures were considerable, and Piri's fleet was indeed in poor condition after months of campaigning in harsh conditions. Piri accepted the offer and abandoned the siege. His reasoning, as he would later explain, was partly tactical. His ships were in poor condition, badly in need of maintenance and repair, hulls fouled with barnacles and marine growth, sails torn and rotted by sun and salt spray, rigging frayed and unreliable. Additionally, intelligence had reached him that a powerful Portuguese relief fleet was sailing to Hormuz's aid from their bases in India, and he feared being trapped and destroyed between the fortress garrison and the relief force. The decision to accept the bribe and withdraw seemed, from one perspective, prudent. Ottoman ships in such poor condition would be at severe disadvantage if forced into a major naval battle. Better to withdraw with treasure and preserved forces than to risk everything in a battle the fleet might not be able to win. Piri ordered the treasures loaded onto 3 of his ships and left the bulk of his fleet, 28 ships, in the safer harbor of Basra under the protection of the Ottoman governor there, Kubad Pasha. With his 3 treasure-laden vessels, Piri attempted to break through the Portuguese blockade that was indeed forming at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. The attempt succeeded, though 1 ship was lost to Portuguese action, and Piri arrived in Egypt with 2 ships full of plunder from Hormuz. From a purely practical standpoint, he had preserved most of his fleet and acquired considerable wealth for the Ottoman treasury. It seemed like a tactical withdrawal in the face of superior forces, a reasonable decision by an experienced commander making the best of a difficult situation. But the political situation in Cairo and Constantinople saw it very differently. Kubad Pasha, the Ottoman governor of Basra, had expected a share of the plunder Piri had acquired, and when this was not forthcoming, he filed complaints with the imperial court. The governor of Egypt, Mehmed Pasha, also had political reasons to view Piri with hostility. Perhaps he saw an opportunity to seize the treasure for himself, or perhaps there were other political rivalries at play. Reports were sent to Sultan Suleiman in Constantinople, and these reports painted a damning picture. Piri Reis had accepted bribes from the enemy, undermining Ottoman military objectives for personal gain. He had abandoned his fleet, leaving ships and men under the protection of another governor rather than maintaining command. He had fled the battle to save his own skin and his treasure, demonstrating cowardice in the face of the enemy. He had left Ottoman soldiers and sailors at the mercy of the Portuguese, a betrayal of those under his command. Piri tried to defend himself, explaining that his ships were unseaworthy and that staying would have meant the destruction of the entire fleet. He argued that he had made a tactical retreat to preserve Ottoman forces for future operations, not an act of cowardice, but of prudent command. He pointed to his decades of loyal service, his victories at Aden and Muscat, his contributions to Ottoman naval power and geographical knowledge. But his explanations fell on deaf ears, or perhaps on ears that were determined not to hear. The political machinations at work may have had less to do with Piri's actual conduct and more to do with various officials seeking scapegoats, settling old scores, or attempting to seize the treasure he had brought back. The accusations of cowardice were particularly stinging and dangerous. In Ottoman military culture, honor and courage were paramount virtues, and the suggestion that a commander had run from battle was one of the gravest charges that could be leveled. The additional accusation of accepting bribes added financial corruption to alleged military incompetence, a devastating combination.
Whether these charges were fair or accurate, whether Piri was a victim of political intrigue or had genuinely failed in his duty, has been debated by historians ever since. Contemporary Ottoman historian Ibrahim Peçevi later wrote that the bribery charge was implausible, suggesting that Piri had been caught up in political scheming rather than actual wrongdoing. But Peçevi noted that the Sultan deigned to believe it and issued an order of execution. Perhaps Suleiman, now in his 60s and facing numerous challenges to Ottoman power, felt he needed to send a message about the consequences of military failure, regardless of the underlying circumstances. Perhaps the political factions at court had convinced him that Piri was guilty. Perhaps he never received Piri's defense, or didn't credit it if he did. In Cairo, in either 1553 or 1554, the exact date remains uncertain, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent's execution order arrived. Piri Reis was executed in a public execution, the traditional Ottoman method for condemned officials. He was approximately 83 years old, ending a life that spanned nearly the entire period of Ottoman naval expansion and achievement. His patrimony that he had accumulated over decades of service, including the treasures from Hormuz that cost him his life, was confiscated by the state and eventually made its way to the Topkapı Palace in Istanbul, there to join all the other accumulated wealth and artifacts of the Ottoman Empire. Thus ended the life of one of history's most accomplished cartographers and navigators. His final years were marred by accusations that may or may not have been just. He died executed in a land far from his birthplace, far from the Dardanelles where he grew up watching ships sail between seas. His maps and books were scattered across various libraries and palaces. His greatest cartographic work, the 1513 world map, lay hidden away in archives where it would remain forgotten for nearly 400 years. But the story of the map was not over. It was merely sleeping, waiting for someone to find it again. The centuries passed slowly, like water wearing away stone, like sand accumulating grain by grain on forgotten shores. The Ottoman Empire reached its zenith under Suleiman the Magnificent, then slowly began its long decline, lasting another 3 centuries before finally collapsing in the aftermath of World War I.
Gallipoli, Piri's birthplace, would become famous for different reasons. The site of brutal battles in 1915 and 1916, where Ottoman forces fought Allied troops in trenches and on beaches, where hundreds of thousands died in a campaign that accomplished little for either side. The Topkapı Palace, which had been the center of Ottoman power for generations, was eventually converted into a museum in the new Turkish Republic that emerged from the empire's ashes. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, departed in 1922, and Mustafa Kemal Ataturk began the project of transforming Turkey into a modern, secular nation-state. And in the vast collections of that palace, bundled away in forgotten storage among countless other documents and artifacts accumulated over centuries of imperial rule, lay a fragment of gazelle skin covered in faded ink. The parchment had survived fires, floods, the carelessness of generations of palace staff who had no idea what it was. It had survived revolutions and wars, the fall of an empire and the birth of a republic. It had been overlooked, ignored, bundled with other forgotten materials, waiting patiently in the darkness for someone to recognize its value. The year 1929 was eventful in world history. In October, the New York stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression that would devastate economies worldwide for the next decade. In Turkey, the modernizing reforms of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk were reshaping the nation. And in Istanbul, the conversion of Topkapı Palace into a museum meant that scholars were going through centuries of accumulated materials, cataloging and preserving what they found. On October 9th of that year, a German theologian named Gustav Adolf Deissmann was working in the palace. Dr. Halil Edhem Eldem, the director of National Museums, had invited Deissmann to tour the collections, recognizing that Western scholars might bring fresh perspectives and expertise to cataloging the palace's treasures. Deissmann had persuaded the Rockefeller Foundation to fund a project to preserve the palace's ancient manuscripts, particularly non-Islamic texts that might otherwise be neglected.
Halil Edhem gave Deisman unprecedented access, including to hidden rooms, underground chambers, and even a crypt that could only be reached through a trapdoor. These were spaces that had rarely been visited, where materials had been stored and forgotten, sometimes for centuries. The air in these storage areas was thick with dust, carrying the musty smell of old parchment and decaying leather bindings. Shafts of light from small windows cut through the gloom, illuminating motes of dust disturbed by the scholar's movements. The temperature was cooler than the sunlit chambers above, with a dampness that had fortunately not been severe enough to completely destroy the documents stored there. Among bundles of old, discarded material, Deisman came across an unusual parchment. It was a map, but unlike any map he had seen before. The gazelle skin was old and damaged, with only a portion of what had clearly once been a much larger map surviving. Much of the original had been lost, whether cut away deliberately, damaged by water or fire, or simply deteriorated over time remained unclear. But what survived showed coastlines that looked remarkably like South America, drawn with impressive detail alongside portions of Africa and Europe. As Deisman studied the map more closely, his excitement grew. The parchment showed signs of great age. The ink had faded but remained legible. The cartographic style was clearly from an earlier era. And there were inscriptions, text written around the margins and across the map itself in what appeared to be Ottoman Turkish and Arabic. He showed the parchment to Orientalist Paul Kalla, who was visiting Istanbul at the time. Kalla was an expert in Islamic manuscripts and languages, precisely the person needed to decipher the inscriptions. Kalla examined the map carefully, noting the extensive annotations. The Arabic colophon provided crucial information. The map had been created by Piri Reis in spring of 1513, over 400 years earlier. And one of the Turkish inscriptions explicitly stated that portions of the map had been taken from a map by Christopher Columbus. The significance hit them immediately. If this Ottoman map from 1513 contained portions of a Columbus map, it might be the only surviving trace of Columbus's original cartographic work. None of Columbus's own maps had survived into the 20th century. They had been lost, destroyed, or simply never preserved. The Spanish crown had been notoriously secretive about geographical information, and many important documents had been lost when archives burned or were neglected. But here, incorporated into this Turkish map, might be a window into what Columbus himself had drawn, showing what he believed he had discovered, preserving his understanding of the New World's geography. Within months, news of the discovery was spreading through scholarly circles worldwide. Powell Pale presented the finding at the 18th Congress of Orientalists in Leiden in September of 1931. His report generated immediate excitement. The discovery of a major historical document, particularly one connected to Columbus's voyages, was significant news in academic circles. The report was quickly translated into Italian and Spanish, languages where interest in Columbus was particularly intense. Newspapers picked up the story, though they sometimes misrepresented it, calling it Columbus's map, rather than a map incorporating information from Columbus. But the essence of the discovery, that an Ottoman cartographer had preserved geographical information that was otherwise lost, was accurately conveyed. The rediscovery came at a time when Turkey was seeking to establish itself as a modern nation with a proud historical heritage. Ataturk himself took personal interest in the map, recognizing its value as a symbol of Ottoman achievement in science and navigation. He ordered the production of high-quality facsimiles so scholars worldwide could study reproductions without handling the fragile original. He sponsored research into Piri Reis and his works, encouraging Turkish scholars to reclaim this piece of their heritage. The map became a source of national pride, a reminder that while Europeans had been exploring the New World, Ottoman scholars had been documenting those discoveries with remarkable skill and accuracy. But as scholars studied the map more closely, certain features began to generate not just interest, but controversy. The surviving fragment of Piri Reis's map showed the Atlantic Ocean, with Europe and Africa on the right side and the Americas on the left. The Brazilian coast was detailed and accurate. The Caribbean islands were recognizable. But at the southern end of the map, below South America, there was something peculiar, a landmass that curved dramatically eastward, a coastline that didn't quite match what should be there. For decades, this southern landmass was interpreted as simply a distorted representation of the South American coast, perhaps showing Patagonia with exaggerated curvature due to the difficulties of projection or errors in Piri's source materials. Early studies focused on the map's value as a historical document, showing Columbus's discoveries and early 15th century geographical knowledge. The controversies were scholarly but measured. Cartographic historians debated which Columbus voyage the source map represented, probably the third voyage of 1498 to 1500, when Columbus explored the South American mainland. They discussed the projection techniques Piri had used, comparing them to other portolan charts of the era. They analyzed the source maps he had cited, trying to understand how he had synthesized such diverse materials. These were respectable academic debates, the normal process of historical scholarship as experts examined a newly discovered document and tried to understand its significance and accuracy. But in 1965, everything changed when a professor of history at the University of New Hampshire named Charles Hapgood published a book that would transform the Piri Reis map from a historical curiosity into a phenomenon of alternative history. The book was titled Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, Evidence of Advanced Civilization in the Ice Age, and its claims were extraordinary, claims that would capture imaginations and generate controversy that continues to this day. Hapgood and his students had studied the Piri Reis map extensively, along with other ancient and medieval maps. They concluded that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map wasn't South America at all, or a distorted representation of it. Instead, they claimed, it was Antarctica, depicted as it would appear if all the ice were removed. And furthermore, they argued that it matched the actual coastline beneath the Antarctic ice sheet with uncanny accuracy.
The implications of this claim, if true, would be staggering and would require rewriting much of what we thought we knew about ancient history. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until the early 19th century. The continent has been covered by ice for millions of years, an ice sheet so massive that it contains about 90% of the world's ice and 70% of Earth's fresh water. If Piri Reis's map from 1513 showed an accurate, ice-free Antarctic coastline, it could only mean one thing. The map was based on source materials far older than anyone had imagined, created by an advanced civilization that had existed before the ice-covered Antarctica, a civilization capable of accurately mapping the entire globe. Hapgood's theory went further. He suggested that the map's accuracy would have required aerial capabilities, the ability to view the continent from above to achieve the perspective and accuracy visible in the map. He argued that the advanced map-making techniques visible in the map implied mathematical and astronomical knowledge far beyond what 16th century or even ancient civilizations were supposed to possess. He even proposed a mechanism for how such ancient maps might have survived through the millennia. Perhaps they had been preserved in places like the Library of Alexandria, that great repository of ancient knowledge in Egypt. Perhaps they had been copied and recopied by successive generations of scholars who didn't understand their full significance but recognized their value. Perhaps fragments of this ancient geographical knowledge had survived in classical texts, in Arabic manuscripts, and eventually made their way into the hands of Piri Reis in the early 1600s. The book caught the imagination of many readers. It seemed to offer tangible evidence for long-held speculations about lost advanced civilizations, Atlantis, perhaps, or other legendary cultures that had been dismissed as mere mythology. Here was physical evidence, a map that appeared to show impossible knowledge, knowledge that could only have been acquired by a sophisticated ancient civilization. Some writers took Hapgood's ideas even further. If ancient peoples couldn't have created such accurate maps on their own, perhaps they had been helped by extraterrestrial visitors bringing advanced knowledge from other worlds. Or perhaps the maps were evidence of a pole shift, a sudden catastrophic movement of Earth's crust that had thrust Antarctica from a temperate climate into its current polar position, explaining both how it could have been mapped ice-free and why such an advanced civilization had vanished so completely. Hapgood's work was endorsed by some respected figures.
U.S. Air Force cartographers did provide statements supporting his projections and overlays, though later scholars would argue these endorsements were qualified and limited, more expressions of interest than definitive confirmation. The statements acknowledged that some features of the map were intriguing, but didn't necessarily validate the extraordinary conclusions Hapgood drew from them. Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings became a best-selling book, finding an audience far beyond academic circles. The Piri Reis map entered popular culture as a symbol of mysterious ancient knowledge, appearing in documentaries, popular history books, and countless websites and articles. The map became famous, but for reasons Piri Reis himself would never have imagined. But mainstream historians, geographers, and cartographers were deeply skeptical of Hapgood's theories. The scholarly community's response to Hapgood's theories was swift and pointed. While acknowledging that Hapgood's book was interesting and thought-provoking in the way it challenged readers to look at ancient maps with fresh eyes, experts in cartographic history systematically dismantled his claims. The problems with the Antarctica hypothesis were numerous and fundamental, touching on cartography, geology, and basic logic. First, when the actual Piri Reis map was compared to modern maps of Antarctica's subglacial coastline using proper cartographic methods, the supposed similarity vanished. Hapgood's comparisons involved creating modified projections and selectively emphasizing certain features while ignoring others that didn't fit his theory. It was a case of seeing patterns that weren't really there, like seeing shapes in clouds. The human mind is remarkably good at finding patterns, even in random data, especially when looking for something specific. When cartographic historian Gregory McIntosh conducted a thorough analysis published in 2000 using rigorous cartographic methods and proper projections, he found that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map bore no significant resemblance to Antarctica's actual coastline, whether ice-covered or not. The shapes didn't match, the proportions were wrong, and the geographical relationship to South America was incompatible with any representation of Antarctica. Second, the theory required Antarctica to have been ice-free recently enough for ancient humans to have mapped it. Hapgood suggested around 4000 BC, which would place it in the time frame of early civilizations. But ice core data from Antarctica has definitively shown that the continent has been covered by ice for over 10 million years, not the few thousand years Hapgood's theory required. Scientists had drilled deep into the Antarctic ice, extracting cores that preserved a record of Earth's climate going back hundreds of thousands of years. The data was unambiguous. There was no ancient ice-free Antarctica for anyone to map. The continent had been frozen solid long before humans evolved, let alone develop the capability to create accurate maps. Third, if the southern landmass were Antarctica, its position on the Piri Reis map would suggest that Antarctica and South America were connected at Uruguay, which they never have been in human times. The geography simply doesn't work. Antarctica is separated from South America by the Drake Passage, about 600 miles of some of the roughest ocean on Earth. No continental connection has existed in the time frame of human existence. Fourth, there are much simpler and more historically grounded explanations for the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map. One likely explanation is that it represents Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, a hypothetical southern continent that many medieval and Renaissance cartographers believed must exist to balance the landmasses in the northern hemisphere. This was a theoretical construct based on the ancient Greek idea of symmetry in Earth's geography, the notion that there must be landmasses in the south to balance those in the north. Many 16th century maps include such a continent, purely as speculation, filling the southern reaches of the map with an imagined landmass whose actual shape and extent were completely unknown. Piri may have included it based on Ptolemaic geographical theories or on maps from his source materials that incorporated this speculative landmass. It would be perfectly consistent with the map-making traditions of his era to include such features, even if they were more theoretical than observed. Another possibility is that the southern landmass is simply a distorted extension of the South American coast, with the curvature exaggerated due to the challenges of projecting spherical geography onto flat surface, especially when working from multiple source maps at different scales. Such distortions are extremely common in early maps, which lacked the mathematical tools to correctly represent curved surfaces on flat parchment. Fifth, the supposed advanced mathematical techniques visible in the map turn out to be the standard techniques of portolan chart making, which had been refined over 2 centuries of Mediterranean seafaring. The windrose network, the compass lines, the representation of coastlines, all were well-established conventions, sophisticated certainly, but well within the capabilities of skilled early 16th century cartographers. Piri explicitly stated his sources and methods in his inscriptions. He wasn't claiming to have accessed ancient advanced civilizations or mysterious lost knowledge. He was describing, quite straightforwardly, a scholarly synthesis of contemporary and recent maps from Arabic, Portuguese, Spanish, and other sources, combined with his own observational experience from decades at sea. Scholars noted that Hapgood's theory required dismissing or ignoring vast amounts of evidence while accepting extraordinary claims on the basis of very thin and subjective pattern matching. It violated the principle of Occam's razor, the idea that simpler explanations are generally preferable to complex ones. When you have 2 possible explanations, one involving well-documented historical processes and one requiring lost advanced civilizations, the simpler explanation is almost always correct. The scientific consensus firmly rejected the Antarctica hypothesis, classifying it as pseudo-archaeology or fringe history. Interesting speculation, perhaps, but not supported by the evidence. Yet the controversy persists to this day, refusing to fade away despite the scholarly refutations. Despite being thoroughly debunked in academic literature, the Antarctica on the Piri Reis map theory continues to appear in popular books, documentaries, and internet discussions. Writers like Eric von Däniken have used it to support claims of ancient astronauts bringing advanced knowledge to primitive humans. Graham Hancock has cited it as evidence for an advanced lost civilization comparable to Atlantis, destroyed in a global catastrophe at the end of the last ice age. The map has appeared in numerous conspiracy theories and alternative history narratives, often alongside other out-of-place artifacts claimed to show impossible ancient knowledge. This persistence raises interesting questions about why such theories are attractive. Perhaps it's the appeal of mystery, the desire to believe that history is deeper and stranger than the conventional narrative suggests. Perhaps it's skepticism about academic authority, a sense that mainstream scholars are too conservative or too invested in established narratives to recognize revolutionary evidence. Perhaps it's simple fascination with the idea that our ancestors were more advanced than we give them credit for, that there is more to human history than the slow march from primitive to civilized. Or perhaps it's the romance of lost knowledge, the idea that wisdom from vanished ages might still be recovered if we only look carefully enough at surviving artifacts. Whatever the reason, the Piri Reis map has become as much a cultural phenomenon as a historical artifact. It means different things to different people. To scholars, a valuable historical document showing early 16th century geographical knowledge. To alternative historians, evidence of impossible ancient wisdom. To the Turkish nation, a symbol of Ottoman achievement in the sciences. But what can we actually know, setting aside speculation and focusing on verified evidence? When we return to the map itself, looking at what it actually shows and what Piri Reis actually said about it, a remarkable story emerges, one that doesn't require ancient aliens or lost civilizations, but is nonetheless impressive and historically significant. The map is indeed a masterpiece of early 16th century cartography. The Brazilian coastline is astonishingly accurate for a map created only 13 years after Portuguese ships first reached that coast in 1500. The African coastline shows impressive accuracy. The Caribbean islands are recognizable. The attention to detail, the careful synthesis of multiple sources, the scholarly annotations, all speak to Piri Reis's skill and dedication. The map represents something genuinely important, the global exchange of geographical knowledge in the age of exploration. It shows how information flowed between different cultures and civilizations. Columbus's voyages were Spanish, but within years an Ottoman cartographer had acquired and incorporated that knowledge. Portuguese explorations of Africa fed into Arabic and Ottoman geographical scholarship. Classical Greek knowledge preserved in Islamic texts informed Renaissance European mapmaking, which in turn influenced Ottoman cartographers like Piri. The map is evidence of a connected world where knowledge crossed borders and cultures, where scholars built on each other's work regardless of nationality or religion. It's a reminder that the age of exploration wasn't just Europeans discovering the world, but a complex, multi-sided process where different civilizations contributed to and benefited from expanding geographical understanding. Piri Reis himself emerges as a fascinating figure, a sailor who became a scholar, a warrior who created beautiful works of art and learning, a man who synthesized practical experience with theoretical knowledge. His life spanned the Ottoman Empire's rise to maritime power. He witnessed the fall of Muslim Spain and the discovery of the Americas. He participated in great naval battles and created works that would outlast empires. His tragic end, executed on possibly unjust charges after a lifetime of service, reminds us that history is often cruel to its participants, even as it preserves their legacies. Piri died in disgrace, his name temporarily tarnished, his achievements forgotten. But his map survived, and with it his reputation has been restored. The Kitab-ı Bahriye, his book of navigation, remained in use for centuries after his death, guiding Ottoman sailors through Mediterranean waters. The world maps, though fragmentary, preserved geographical knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. His inscriptions provide invaluable historical information about his sources and methods. In the end, the real mystery of the Piri Reis map isn't whether it shows Antarctica or ancient lost civilizations. The real mystery is how one man, working with the tools and knowledge of his time, managed to create something so accurate and comprehensive that it still impresses us 500 years later.
The real mystery is how knowledge travels through time and across cultures, preserved by people who understood its value, even when they didn't fully understand its implications. The real mystery is how a fragment of gazelle skin, covered in faded ink, could sleep in darkness for 4 centuries and then wake to capture imaginations around the world. Today, the Piri Reis map resides in the Topkapı Palace Museum in Istanbul, carefully preserved in climate-controlled conditions. It's too fragile to be on permanent display, but high-quality reproductions allow visitors to see this remarkable artifact. Scholars continue to study it, comparing it to other early maps, analyzing its sources, extracting every bit of historical information it contains. The map has been analyzed with modern technology, high-resolution photography, spectral imaging to reveal faded details, computer-assisted projections to understand how Piri transferred information from source maps to his own synthesis. Each analysis reveals new details, new insights into his methods and sources. Turkish scholars have intensively studied Piri Reis and his works, reclaiming him as an important figure in Ottoman history and Turkish heritage. The Kitab-ı Bahriye has been published in modern editions, making his navigational knowledge accessible to contemporary readers. His life story has been told in books, documentaries, and educational materials. But perhaps most remarkably, despite all the study and analysis, despite the scientific debunking of alternative theories, the map retains its power to fascinate. People still look at it and wonder. They trace the coastlines with their eyes, read the inscriptions, imagine Piri bent over his work by lamplight, carefully transferring information from ancient and recent maps onto gazelle skin parchment. They wonder what it was like to live in an age when the world was still being discovered, when each voyage might reveal coastlines never before seen by European or Ottoman eyes, when the map of the world was incomplete and expanding. They wonder about the Columbus map that Piri incorporated, forever lost except for what he preserved. They wonder about the other source maps he used, most of which have also vanished into history. They wonder about the southern landmass, whether it's a distorted South America or theoretical Terra Australis, or simply an artifact of cartographic projection. And for some, despite the scientific consensus, the Antarctica theory retains its appeal. And perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps maps should retain some mystery, some invitation to wonder and imagine. Piri Reis created his map to preserve and share knowledge, but also to inspire, to show the vastness and complexity of the world, to encourage others to explore and discover. 500 years later, his map still accomplishes that purpose. The night is quiet now as we come to the end of this long journey through time and mystery. The story of Piri Reis and his remarkable map has unfolded before us,
a story of adventure and scholarship, of imperial ambitions and personal tragedy, of loss and rediscovery, of knowledge preserved across centuries and cultures. The truth about the map may be less sensational than theories about ancient advanced civilizations, but it's no less wonderful. It's a testament to human curiosity, to the desire to understand and document the world, to preserve knowledge for future generations. As you rest tonight, perhaps you can imagine that fragment of parchment carefully preserved in Istanbul, still showing coastlines drawn 5 centuries ago by an Ottoman sailor scholar who devoted his life to understanding the seas and shores of a world that was, in his time, still being discovered. Perhaps you can imagine the countless hands that touched it, Piri's own carefully drawing each line, Sultan Selim's receiving it as a gift, the unknown palace officials who stored it away, Gustav Adolf Deismann's trembling slightly as he realized what he had found, the conservators who now care for it, ensuring it will survive for future generations. And perhaps, as sleep overtakes you, you can imagine yourself on the deck of a ship in the Aegean with the young Piri Reis learning to read coastlines and stars, beginning a journey that would lead to the creation of one of history's most fascinating and mysterious maps. If you enjoyed this journey through history tonight, please consider giving this video a gentle like. And if you'd like to drift off to more historical mysteries and forgotten stories, subscribe to the channel. Until next time, may your dreams be as vast and mysterious as the unexplored oceans of Piri Reis's age. Safe journeys wherever sleep may take you tonight.